Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, good morning, and welcome to the Sky News Politico podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes. A podcast that might be way out of line, but remains tariff-free.
Well, tariff-free for now, anyway. Good morning. It's Monday, February the 3rd, 2025. My name's Anne McElvoy, Executive Editor at Politico. And with me is Sam Coates of Sky News. And yes, Donald Trump has been talking about Britain overnight. He's been opining about Keir Starmer and tariffs just hours before our PM heads to Brussels to attend the first summit by a British leader since Brexit.
I do wonder whether Donald Trump is sometimes news editor-in-chief on the Globe. He manages to insert himself in every story, it sometimes feels like. That's right, Donald Trump's been making clear the UK will be tariff-free for now. He was speaking before he was getting on Air Force One, and he said that the EU would be hit with import tariffs because they are atrocious and don't import enough American goods, but we are different. And he said that he thought that Prime Minister Keir Starmer was very nice after the several conversations that they'd had.
Yes, you could say we're getting away lightly there at the beginning of the Trump administration, at least. And while the new president said that the UK is way out of line, by which he means we don't import enough US goods in his eyes, he was suggesting that wasn't enough for immediate tariffs on us. And that's one for Keir Starmer to respond to, along with, of course, Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, who starts as ambassador today in Washington after Karen Pierce signed off from the job on social media, saying it had been an extraordinary privilege. So enter the Prince of Darkness stage left, but with the light shining on him in the new Trump era.
That's right. I think we're going to have a rocky day all round, though, because the markets are going to have to react to Trump, who over the weekend hit Canada and Mexico and China with steep tariffs on Saturday, and then suggested tariffs were heading to the EU overnight into Monday. And as we were saying, we escape for now. But all of this gives a greater sense of urgency to the big themes of this week, which is what should Britain's relationship with the rest of the European Union actually look like, and whether or not they've actually decided that in Downing Street. And that's pretty much top of this week's agenda with Keir Starmer's trip to Brussels. Anne, do you want to whiz through what's going on this week?
Sure. Well, Keir Starmer is in Brussels meeting European leaders and the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, gives a speech this morning defending her reforms and setting out the new way Ofsted will judge schools. It's Department for Work and Pensions questions. So a moment to find out more about the disability benefit reforms being planned. There's always controversy there. And a farming protest on the North and South circulars around London, which you may therefore wish to avoid, unless you want to be on the farming protest, of course.
On Tuesday, discussions between UK and the EU continue, but at a slightly lower level. And Nick Thomas-Simmons, who's sort of in charge of all of that, is giving his EU reset speech in Brussels. There's a low pay commission report into the national minimum wage, and Donald Trump is meeting Benjamin Netanyahu in the White House.
There's an electric vehicle roundtable in the Department for Transport, and Ed Miliband hosts the Net Zero Council with CEOs who are intended to help government with those green targets and that technological transition.
Bank of England on Thursday announces its interest rate decision at midday, and on Friday there's some kind of announcement on new road schemes, but that's the broad thrust of what it looks like in the diaries that we've seen. So let's begin with Keir Starmer heading to the first EU summit for a British Prime Minister since Brussels. He's the first to attend and actually get dinner. I think Theresa May went but didn't get the food, and the overnight backdrop seems more important than ever, and that's brought into the sharpest focus because of what Donald Trump was saying overnight. He seems on absolutely intent on forcing the UK to choose, if he can, and choose on trade. Now, Keir Starmer's big goal with his foreign policy is to cozy up to China, cozy up to the US, and cozy up to the EU simultaneously without big blowback from either. But when you listen to Donald Trump overnight, that just feels that bit harder because he seems very, very riled up on the fact that the US cannot export food and agriculture goods to the EU because it has different, and the EU would say higher standards. And Keir Starmer looks like he's on a course to hitching the UK even closer to those EU standards that it was part of for so many years. But that would potentially put himself further in Trump's firing line. And what's going on? Can Keir Starmer do diplomacy in three different directions at once? Is there a choice coming down and do we get to learn more about that today?
Definitely multi-dimensional chess going on here, isn't it? So Keir Starmer on the upside, Sam, he gets dinner, right? And the one thing I can tell you, Politico operating very well in Brussels as well as the UK, is that if you're invited and don't get to the dinner and don't get to that big table with all of the other leaders, you're really on the naughty step. And that is where Britain has been. That is no longer the case. I think to that extent, Keir Starmer's warm-up with the major European capitals has worked pretty well. But as you suggest, what's cut across it is we have a leader, Donald Trump, who's come in, who's really going the full MAGA this time on tariffs and trade, much more than he did in his first administration, and does seem to be saying, yeah, this is some zero game, you have to choose, which is the one thing, of course, Keir Starmer said he didn't want to do. He felt that the UK could do best operating between the US, between the EU and its policy on China. So it's really how long he can hold that together.
The big question is, what does the UK want from Brussels post-Brexit? Now we've got a new government that's happy to reset the relationship and make things a bit closer. And what is the EU actually prepared to give us? Now, as Tim Shipman wrote yesterday, as Nick Thomas-Symonds has said in the Commons, there are a series of areas that the UK is looking for a closer relationship on. They are defence, security, crime, migration and trade. So they're the big areas for negotiation over the coming weeks. But the thing is, Anne, I'm told that the backdrop of this summit is there is a grumbling in the EU that we might have the headings, but the EU don't properly know what the UK is asking for. That's the perception in some European capitals that we get. Now, I'm told that there was a cabinet subcommittee, that one of those sort of decision committees in government that met last Tuesday for the second time since the general election. And they considered papers on two things, both of them potentially quite controversial and sort of cropped up in different forms on the front pages this morning. One is what's known in the jargon as the ugly phrase SPS, phytosanitary standards. For those of you listening early in the morning, that essentially means agriculture and food standards, which is incredibly contentious because the EU have particularly high standards. The US have cheaper food that critics would say adheres to lower standards, and that's the area that Donald Trump is particularly annoyed that he can't have a bigger export market to the EU on, and also on energy cooperation. There's a question, and again, this is another very nerdy area, about whether or not the UK and the EU might end up merging their energy trading schemes, and there's a very particular reason behind that, and that's because in January of next year, if you don't merge the UK and the EU energy trading schemes, then there's a very particular carbon pricing impact. Effectively, a tax will be levied on some goods going to the EU because of the amount of carbon that they take up in their manufacturing in the UK. And if you don't sort the issue of the carbon price before January, then some British goods going to the EU are going to get more expensive. So those are the two things highest up the agenda. But as for the greater sort of idea, I think Keir Starmer's going to try and kickstart the conversation on some kind of mutual defence pact with the EU. But beyond that, when it comes to trade, I think there's a little bit of confusion on the EU end about exactly what we want.
Can I just say, who wouldn't want to start their week with Sam on phytosanitary standards? and carbon pricing. Knock yourselves out. But yes, I think that's absolutely right. And one of my colleagues actually was reporting in Playbook this morning that an EU diplomat was reflecting that they welcome this warming up, but there is a bit of concern, I think, on the European side that it's all sort of getting somewhere, but never really setting a firm target. Warm words was a phrase used there. I think that there is also, and talking to sources there in Brussels, that it all depends really on how Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, views this process as well. So I think the aim at the moment is, you're absolutely right, that Keir Starmer doesn't want to tie himself down other than on things like defence and security, where he's really happy to, because Britain brings a lot to the table. But Downing Street really hammering home the red lines, not rejoining the single market, customs union, an area where I think probably quite a lot of ministers would like to see some move in that direction, but that seems to be off the table, and certainly not restoring free movement, which cuts across, I think, a desire on the EU side to see some progress on some sort of schemes for young people and students to be able to travel more freely to Britain, and of course vice versa. But that then hits Keir Starmer where he doesn't really want to be hit, which is on anything to do with movement, with immigration, etc. My surmise here is that there is also some strategy here that if you start going in through the door, say, well, we want this, but we don't want that right now, you might go off track between now and April or May of the full summit. Maybe some of this can be put through a sieve and worked out. That seems to be the kind of gradualist British position. And in the meantime, just be nice to everyone in Europe. Say hello in every European language.
It's not clear to me that the issue isn't that we're not giving enough up front. So let me explain what I mean. Of course, you've got the UK asks, but you've also got the EU asks. And a sense, actually, that just as the UK might not know entirely what it wants, the EU is perhaps being a bit unreasonable in itself. Right. So there was originally a plan that there would be a spring summit in April or May, and that's where you would agree a security partnership. Now, you'll hear a bit about this today. It's essentially based on the Norway model with the EU on foreign and defence. So regular cooperation meetings, some system that means that the UK Army can take part in some EU missions, some structure around that. And I think everybody wanted that to be done and dusted in April, May. But it's not entirely clear that that can happen, in part because the French are being pretty unreasonable on the subject of fish, and the Germans are being tough on youth mobility scheme. And in particular, the French position on fish is, until that's sorted out, you can't agree anything else. So one of the jobs of Keir Starmer at the summit today is to see if he can get that Defence and Security Pact agreement back on track, back on timetable to April or May. But why might it be that the UK isn't giving enough? Well, what the French are asking for on fish is essentially a rollover of the existing position, which, to be honest, is not something that's that hard for Britain to give. But it's part of that bloody-minded Cabinet Office, Foreign Office mindset that says you can't offer anything until you're absolutely sure of the concession. So we're right back into that typical Brexit space of who jumps first. And a lot of kind of energy is expended waiting for both sides to show movement first before the other side will reciprocate. And that kind of thing, that old Brexit dynamic of nobody wanting to make the first move is, I'm told, slowing things down. And Keir Starmer getting the nation states pitted against each other and bringing the European Commission into the equation in order to get things going is very much his game today.
Yes, he came in, I think, with, I think there was a sense of relief when Keir Starmer arrived in a lot of European capitals. But as you suggest, that's very different from once you mention the word like fish or your exact energy policy or how you're going to balance out interests in order to get, say, a deal over the line on small boats, principally with France, but that has to go through a wider process. The more specific you get, the more difficult it gets. And I think that's what is going to hit Keir Starmer soon. But we need to move on.
Yes, domestic stuff looms. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, is having her own reset, not a reset, moment this morning. Interviews in the Times, a speech mid-morning. She's been coming under fire from the Tories for changes to academies. For those that weren't paying attention at the back, she is bringing them into line with the curriculum in force in other schools in England. She's making them employ qualified teachers, because at the moment academies can employ teachers that don't have an official qualification. And she's changing the rules around pay, but has already had to sort of clarify that to make sure people realise that it's a floor, not a ceiling for academy play. But such has been the criticism that in her Times interview today, she's had to insist that she's not a Marxist. Now, we'll get onto the specifics of her big plan today and the scheme for Ofsted to grade schools differently. But it feels to me, Anne, like the subject of Bridget Phillipson is a little bit of a case study of what happens when Downing Street doesn't properly pay attention to things that go wrong early enough, which is a big theme in the new book, Get In, by Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrom's, all about Keir Starmer and the right and how the mistakes and the problems and the triumphs of Labour's election operation and the man at the top. So I just thought, before we look more specifically at Bridget Phillipson, Patrick Maguire for this podcast has recorded just a little note on whether or not ignoring a problem, then leading it to become a crisis, is a feature, not a bug, of Keir Starmer's method of leadership.
When things go wrong for Starmer, McSweeney always has somebody else to blame. First it was the hard left, then it was Sam White, who was Gray's predecessor as Chief of Staff, and then, of course, it was Sue. Unable to dislodge it themselves by telling Starmer to sack her, his people needed to let her fail quickly, whatever the cost. And the biggest political wound of all from that first 100 days, the winter fuel allowance cut, that's pretty hard to blame on Sue, and none of her critics have even tried. So ultimately, I think, as so often, it all comes back to Keir. Throughout this story, he's always the last person to wake up to obvious political problems. Remember that person who woke up to it in January 2024? It takes Starmer 9 months to get to that place. But he's also by far the quickest person to correct and adopt a new position. So I think the first 100 days is that dynamic in miniature. And now you can see him moving really hard and really fast to regain some of the initiative they squandered then. The bigger question now, though, is whether he's left it too late.
Patrick Maguire there in a voice note for us. So Bridget Phillipson will use the speech to announce that schools in England will be graded across a variety of different issues, including attendance and inclusion, using a colour-coded 5-point scale. Critics say this is more complicated than the single-word assessment that we got. And will this quell criticism or cause more of it?
I think it's going to cause more of it, because once you start something that is more complex than the system that you were replacing, however justified or otherwise Bridget Phillipson's criticisms of the previous system may be, that every single bit of this, Sam, having looked at education policy over a number of years, you can go through each of the new categories that she proposes and then say, well, hang on, how are you going to make this clear? And when schools get graded in this more nuanced way, then there's a lot more opportunity for people to object, to say, well, that's not fair, or it can't be calibrated against other schools. So I think it's overcomplicated, and that may return to bite her. Your topic at the beginning was really interesting. It was, how much did number 10 really want this? I think a lot of this is seen through the prism of the dreadfully sad, really tragic death of a head teacher, Ruth Perry, who took her own life a while ago after her school was downgraded. Julia Waters, her sister, has come out commenting on this new system, but she doesn't like the idea of this either, and she thinks it's a rehash of the system it was meant to replace. So you'll have some critics saying that, and that it's a rehash, and others saying it's watering down achievement. We're going to hear that a lot from Conservative ministers. So the worry for number 10 is, what are you really achieving by this?
All this against a backdrop that the Tories are ramping up their criticism of this government about education and the changes to academies, changes to pay, changes to freedoms, and now the changes to Ofsted, which they might say downgrades school standards. The government, Bridget Phillipson, will be very strong on that today. But the remarkable thing about particularly the academy changes that are all being made, that are causing all of the fuss and is that they were not in the manifesto. I was looking at the manifesto last night. None of them appear, which is why there just is this briefing that Number 10 haven't been properly across what Bridget Phillipson has been doing and have been, to some senses, irritated with what's been coming out of her department, causing problems that they didn't foresee for things that weren't in the manifesto. I'm sure that will play itself out today. We have gone over our 20 minutes. The alarm has gone, so we better leave everyone to get on with their day. And thank you very much indeed. See you tomorrow.
Great to be with you.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.